I'm Billy Taylor, and that's jazz.
And this is jazz. And this is jazz. And this is jazz. And this, too, is jazz.
Yes, jazz can sound like the music of exotic foreign places and like many other kinds of music. But jazz is distinctly American music. It takes the most important elements in our culture and expresses them in musical terms. Let me give you my definition of jazz. Jazz is a special way of performing music and a repertory that traces that special way of performing as it has evolved over the years. Where did this music come from?
When Africans were captured to be sold as slaves, they were stripped of everything except what they carried inside their heads. Memories of their way of life and their culture. In African society, music had an importance far beyond entertainment. It served as a means of communication between people who spoke different languages, and it was a part of virtually every social activity from work to religious ceremonies. In America, where slaves were not allowed to speak their native languages and were often forbidden to use the drum, music became a means of survival. Forced to work endless hours at back-breaking labor, slaves used music both as a form of relief and a means of communication. They created special songs to make the work more bearable, and songs they called spirituals to express common emotions. Their shared rhythmic sense gave the music a unique vitality and spirit. This early music, created by black slaves, had all the basic characteristics of jazz. It was just a short step from the most rhythmic spirituals and work songs to the first authentic jazz style, ragtime. Though ragtime was created by black musicians, it seemed to express emotions and ideas that were so meaningful to other ethnic groups that it rapidly became the most popular music of its era. Jazz was a part of the popular minstrel shows and vaudeville shows, both of which introduced the music to wider audiences. It was also heard on street corners, in honky-tonks, and at picnics, dances, and other social events. Today, we think of ragtime as piano music, but it was first played on plantations and in southern towns by guitarists, string bands, fiddlers, banjo players, saxophone players, and brass bands, as well as pianists. Scott Joplin has provided us with some of the best-known examples of the ragtime style. Although there were many instrumental groups performing ragtime before him, player piano rolls brought his music into homes all over the country, and the ragtime craze was on. This exciting new music was created simultaneously in many southern towns, but it really caught on in New Orleans. The lively seaport community provided more opportunity than other southern towns for interchange among people of different cultural backgrounds. Its less rigid social attitudes allowed jazz to flourish in saloons, dance halls, honky-tonks, and other places of entertainment, so that the Crescent City became the first true jazz center. In New Orleans, music was and still is at the core of the black community's social life. There was music for church, for such social events as picnics and dances, marching bands for all kinds of special events, for many everyday activities, and for weddings and funerals. Much of this music was ragtime, and out of this everyday need for music came some of history's most innovative jazz musicians. Many of them played on the riverboats that traveled from the great port city of New Orleans, spreading the music up and down the Mississippi. As musicians traveled around, jazz acquired its unique sound and developed its own standards of form, complexity, literacy, and excellence, and its own syntax. Freddie Keppard, Buddy Bolden, King Oliver, and Louis Armstrong were all from the Crescent City. These musicians and others, like Jelly Roll Morton and Sidney Bechet, took the forms used by earlier jazz musicians and organized their musical ideas to provide continuity, variety, logic, and coherence to spontaneous musical expression. Their music was full of contrasts, and it was flexible enough to accommodate a wide variety of personal musical choices. Out of these spontaneous musical ideas, a distinct jazz vocabulary and repertory was taking shape and being written down.
One exception to this trend was the blues. Sometimes called secular spirituals, the blues sounded a lot like traditional spirituals, but the lyrics were different. Where spirituals expressed the group feelings and concerns of slaves, the blues expressed individual feelings and concerns in the years after the Civil War. In early blues, what was being said was more important than how it was being said. Its musicians were usually self-taught, and their music clearly showed the many links between the African-American song style and the traditional African song style.
Started howling, and the rain began to fall.
Although the blues developed alongside ragtime, most ragtime players of the time looked down on the blues, because blues musicians were often illiterate wanderers who played on street corners and in cheap, undesirable places. The blues was basically vocal music, formed from field hollers, cries, shouts, grunts, and other expressive sounds that conveyed emotions too deeply felt to be expressed in ordinary words. Though most singers in the early days were male, like Blind Levin Jefferson,
Backwater riding, southern people can make no time.
the blues was popularized by female singers like Maureen,
Everybody fall in line. Going to tell you about that man of mine.
and Bessie Smith.
Lord, I really don't think no man's love can last. Lord, I don't think no man's
Blues
love.
singers used their voices in ways that instrumentalists then imitated.
As you can hear, blues melodies, harmonies, and rhythms are much simpler than those of ragtime. But they both retain characteristics of African music, such as slurring up and down to a note. Vibrato. Call and response, breaks, and syncopation.
As the popularity of the blues grew, instrumental groups were organized. There were string bands and brass bands. And there were country jazz bands that used homemade instruments like jugs, kazoos, and washboards. And as the music continued to develop a style and repertoire, more traditional jazz ensembles began to incorporate its elements into their work.
The most famous instrumental blues styles were called honky-tonk and barrel house music. Today, these styles are best known as boogie-woogie. And like ragtime, they're thought of by many as basically piano styles.
The blues began to move into the musical mainstream in the 1920s when trained musicians like W.C. Handy discovered the beauty and excitement in this earthy music and structured it in ways that made it accessible to the general public. In fact, Handy's St. Louis Blues is probably the most popular blues song ever written.
Although every jazz style has utilized some elements of the blues itself has continued to develop in its own way, and much of its basic simplicity and earthiness remains to this day.
Country blues was nurtured in Mississippi, Tennessee, and Texas, but it flowered in Chicago and Kansas City, where it took on city attitudes. These urban centers attracted musicians from all over the country. Here, blues and ragtime musicians came into closer contact.
In the lively exchange of musical ideas, performers began to improvise or compose spontaneously. Improvisation became one of the essential ingredients of jazz, a tradition that has remained basic ever since, through all the stylistic changes that the music has undergone. But from the start, jazz musicians quickly learned that you could improvise only if you knew the rules. For instance, if I use these three basic chords, G, C, and D, and back to G, in a medium tempo, I can create melodies like this. All that on three chords, but you have to know the chords. Having a personal improvisational style that others could recognize was also important as musicians learned to take a melody and refashion it according to what was becoming a common musical vocabulary.
As jazz developed, great soloists began to emerge and to inspire and influence others.
Their solo improvisations and compositions were copied and studied. Formally trained musicians were influenced by self-taught players and vice versa. It was a time of discovery and crystallization of ideas and forms. Swing, the jazz style of the 1930s, had its roots in ragtime. The basic 2/4 rhythm of ragtime became the basic 4/4 rhythm of swing. Now, when that's translated into the drum set rhythms, sometimes it could sound like this in 2/4. And this with the 4/4 rhythm. The relatively simple ragtime harmonies were expanded, and so were the melodic lines.
The traditional ragtime band of 6 or 7 musicians grew into 14 and 15-piece swing bands with a new sound, a sound that came from merging the blues with ragtime. In the larger groups, the musicians had to read and write music, and musical ranges became more important as the music became more structured. By the middle of the 1930s, jazz had taken off nationwide. big jazz bands played for shows and dances, and all kinds of small jazz combos, trios, quartets, and quintets, played in small nightclubs and on the radio. Radio broadcasts played a key role in popularizing the big swing band sound, and everyone who liked to dance or just listen to jazz knew the styles of Benny Moten, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Fletcher Henderson, Cab Calloway, Benny Goodman, Don Redman, Artie Shaw, Earl Hines, and many others who were setting the standards for swing bands and whose music was heard night after night on the airwaves. The popularity of phonograph records was also growing, and a jukebox was the place where everyone gathered to hear the latest hits.
Oh, you think it's coming a time?
Small jazz combos like those headed by singer Billie Holiday, bassist John Kirby, and vibraphonist Red Norvo were competing with the big bands for space on jukeboxes and in the personal record collections of jazz fans. One of the most popular singers was Ella Fitzgerald. This small combo accompanying her has a much younger me on piano.
How near, how far, the darkest night would shine if you come to me soon, until you will fulfill my heart by the moon.
Even then, she was such a master at scat singing, that is, using her voice as an instrument, that she could compete with the best instrumental improvisers. As jazz records became more and more popular, jazz began to spread to music lovers in other countries. A group of French jazz fans formed the Hot Club of France. One of the first great jazz musicians to come to the fore in Europe was a Belgian gypsy named Django Reinhardt, who became one of the most important influences on the development of jazz guitar. European interest in jazz increased partly as a result of performances by expatriates like Coleman Hawkins, and partly because of the huge influx of American service personnel during World War I. World War II affected jazz in other ways as well. The big bands broke up as their members were drafted into the armed services. As conditions changed at home, vocalists became more popular, and the big bands never recaptured their pre-war domination of the popular music scene. Although black and white Americans were still segregated in the U.S. Armed Forces, the experiences of the war brought about some changes, such as the conscious integration of jazz groups in New York and other large cities. Before the war, when this picture was taken, it was rare to see blacks and whites playing together in public. The late 1930s were years of transition when the seeds of the next important development in jazz were being sown. Charlie Christian was fusing Texas blues with the lyrical melodic style he had learned from Django Reinhardt. Christian was a pioneer in using the amplified guitar as a solo instrument rather than a rhythm instrument in jazz performance. Coleman Hawkins had developed a linear style of playing, while Lester Young was experimenting in another direction, in a more restrained, cooler style. Others, Roy Eldridge, Jimmy Blanton, and Art Tatum, were expanding the vocabulary used by trumpet players, bassists, and pianists. At about the same time, Sid Catlett and Joe Jones were redefining the role of the jazz drummer. All these developments occurred just prior to the emergence of bebop, so that this period of transition later came to be called pre-bop. Duke Ellington, as a composer, arranger, and performer, enlarged the scope of jazz melodically and harmonically. So did Milt Buckner, Don Byas, Trummy Young, Stuff Smith, and Nat King Cole.
Bebop musicians took the next step and radically altered the jazz musician's concept of rhythm. musical vocabulary of jazz, in common with all music, is distinguished by the ways it uses melody, harmony, and rhythm. The composer Tadd Dameron used Cole Porter's What Is This Thing Called Love to create a new jazz song called Hot House. Dameron took this melody. Changed the basic harmony. He changed the rhythm and created a new melody. Dameron mastered the common musical vocabulary and repertory of his time and used it to expand the language of jazz, just as jazz musicians have been doing since the days of ragtime.